Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to the first part of my latest Lenormand reading video series. So this series was inspired by some lovely young ladies who commented on the last video series that I did. So if you're just joining me for this video series, my last one consisted of the meanings that I use when I work with the Lenormand cards. So in the course of that video series, these lovely young ladies asked me at different points, so I always pay attention again to patterns when they show up, but they each asked me at different points if I would be willing to show how I work with a 9-card reading. So in this particular installment of the series, I'm going to be using a method that I call selecting the significator. And so we'll be going through the deck, we'll be picking out a significator card, and we'll be looking at the cards that come before it and after it in a 9-card layout. Right? So that's how I'm going to do it this particular time. In future installments, I plan on, doing the same type of reading using a topic card, so selecting the topic card, or, doing it randomly. So those are 3 ways that I usually work with a 9-card. One of the beautiful things about working with a 9-card, if you're just starting out like I was, when I first started working with Lenormand, I did not have any intention, rather I was actually very intimidated about doing a grand tableau, right? And so the beautiful thing about working with a 9-card, it prepares you for working with a grand tableau. If you look at aspects of a grand tableau as smaller 9-card readings. So if you read 3 cards, that kind of builds you up to reading a 9-card, and then once you master the 9-card, to your satisfaction, then that better enables you to handle a grand tableau, right? So that is my intention with this, is just to kind of offer ways that are going to help you in your own personal Lenormand practice. So now, having said that, I always say that I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, an authority and an expert on Lenormand. I do not consider myself to be either or, right? I am just a person who is sharing the methods that have been helpful to him and what people have asked to see. So if you work with the cards in a different way, if you have a way that works for you and works with you best and it resonates with you, that is great. And so again, I'm just sharing what has been helpful for me, for the people who find the way that I look at the cards of interest. So having said that, now let me talk about the deck that I'm going to be using. So in this particular video, I am working with the 1889 Lenormand Oracle that is by Jennifer Cast of For the Seekers. So now that I've talked about the deck, let's get to the table and take a closer look at how I go through reading a 9-card Lenormand reading using the selecting the significator method. And here we are with the deck on the table. And so once again, we are working with the 1889 Lenormand Oracle by Jennifer Cast of For the Seekers. And so I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to shuffle the cards. And I'm going to shuffle them a number of ways because I want a good shuffle here. So as I'm shuffling, let's think of an intention for the reading. So let's say, because I know that one of the ladies who suggested that I do a series on working with a 9-card spread, she also at some point asked me when I was doing my Grand Tableau video series about working with love or romance related questions. So let's use that as an example. So this way she gets a twofer. She gets to see a 9-card reading, but it's also about I'm guessing one of her favorite topics when she works with the cards, and that's on love and romance. So let's say we have a woman. Her name is Jane, and she has recently met a man, and let's just keep it interesting. Let's say she met a man online, you know, maybe using a online dating service. So she met a man and she went out with him once, and let's say the man's name is Bill. So we have Bill and Jane. So she likes Bill, Jane likes Bill, and wants to know where things might be going. Okay. So now what I would do at this point, I would go ahead and cut the cards. That's one of the things I like to do. And since the question is not about me, I tend to cut the cards away from me. If it was one I was doing for myself, I would cut them towards me. Then I put them back together. So now at this point, what I would do is I turn the deck over. This is one method. I call this the searching for the significator method. So I turn the deck over literally. And then what I do is I go through the cards until I get to, in this case, we're going to be looking for the lady card because that's going to represent Jane. All right, so this is going to be interesting. Okay, so here we have Jane's card, right? So what I do is I take Jane's card out, and then what I do is I look for the 4 cards following it. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and I lay them down, right? So they're going to make up some of the cards. Now I put the remainder of the deck away, and now I'm going to pick up the deck that I just put down, and if you notice, I put all the cards face down in the order that they were originally pulled. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the 4 cards that came before the lady card. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the cards that came before Jane, right? So, and then I take the remainder of the deck and I put that aside. So now these are the cards that are going to be making up the 9 cards. So we have the 4 cards that came before. And the way I do this literally from top to bottom. So now some people may be looking at this and they may pull their cards a different way. That is perfectly fine. Whatever way that you do it and it works for you, that's great. But this is the one that works for me. So I usually go with the first 4 cards, then the focus card. In this case, we're doing the significator of the lady for Jane, and then the 4 cards that came after her. Right? Now some people might say, well, if they take direction in mind, they might go, well, Jane was facing these cards, so wouldn't these cards come afterward? And wouldn't these cards come before? And you could do it that way. Again, if that's your personal preference and it works for you, by all means do it. For me, though, that would work if I was doing a line of 9, like in a straight line, because then these cards would represent the future because she would be facing them. And then these cards would be the past because they would be behind her. But because I'm doing a box or a 3x3 or a 9 card, I don't take that into consideration. I just go in order that they showed up. These came first, then the significator card, and then these came after. So that's how I lay them out. And so now what I'll do is I'll take a moment to lay the cards out and readjust the camera, and we'll get back to how I go through each of the cards. And so here we are with the cards as I laid them out. And so if you remember, the first 4 cards that came before the lady card were snake, tree, child, and gentleman or man. And I love seeing this card here, right? So these were the first 4 cards. Then the following 4 cards after the lady card was coffin, book, ring, and ending the 3x3 or the box or the 9 card is stars, right? So what I do is after we acknowledge what the significator card is, I tend to look at the opening card. For me, the first card represents what's opening the situation up. I kind of look at this as a trigger. It would be like, why is this question being asked or this reading being done? So given the idea here that we're having a situation that involves a woman named Jane, and about her relationship with Bill. And by the way, at this point, I would like to say that I like seeing the fact that the gentleman card and the lady card are not only next to each other, but they're facing one another, right? So that shows the relationship. It shows that there is some sort of promise here because they are facing each other. So I like that. And what I like about this is that even though I kind of just threw a scenario out there as I was shuffling the cards, the Lenormand is backing up the scenario, right? So that's, you always want confirmation and validation through just the way the cards lay themselves out, even before you do the interpretation of the cards and the computations and the permutations and all of that. Just the fact, just laying it out, shows that we have some sort of promise here, because these two cards are not only next to each other but facing each other, right? So there's that. So going back to the opening card, so here we have Snake. Snake, if you have watched my keywords video series where I share what the cards mean for me, you'll know that for me, my personal association with Snake is always complication. That's what I always think of with Snake first. So here, Jane is asking the question because there is some sort of complication she feels at the start, right? And so she may want to know more about that. That may be why she's asking about the future of her relationship with Bill, because she already sees that there is a complication from the start, right? So there's that. Now, the other thing about Snake that's interesting to note is that this is a face card. It has the Queen of Clubs as the playing card insert, and so that can always represent another woman. So it could be that there is a complication because of an entanglement involving another woman, and so we could go again with the layout to validate that, because the Snake card is above the Gentleman card. And so when you're having a Significator card, cards that are above that person can represent what's on his or her mind. So there could be some sort of complication that is on Bill's mind, and it's in the form of another woman, right? So for Jane, though, keeping the context back to Jane, for Jane, she may see a rival for Bill's attention or affection, given with the idea that they're facing each other, right? And so she may see that this other woman potentially could be a rival or a threat to their blossoming relationship. So there's that. So I tend to look at the first card as what's opening up, and then I look at the last card to see what the potential outcome could be. And so here we have Stars, and so Stars is a very positive card. Again, keeping with the idea of like what are the surrounding cards around it. But in this sense, if we're just looking at the potential of how it could end, Stars is a card that can represent hopes and wishes, and I get that from the idea of like when you wish upon a star. So for me, this card can represent hopes and wishes. It could also represent something ideal. I tend to look at stars symbolically as an ideal or a goal. So there's that. So that's how I would look at it. So there may be a complication at the start, or, you know, Jane getting a sense of a complication at the beginning. But if they work through whatever the complication could be, it could potentially end very well for the couple. So I'm seeing that. So now the next thing I would take into account would be direction. You know, I tend to look at the columns one represents the past, one represents the present, one represents the future. But because I read in direction, the lady card is facing this side. So for me, this would be the future, and then what's behind her is the past. So you just have to make a decision, and that's based on personal preference, which side is going to represent the past and which side is going to represent the future. So for me, going forward, I'm going to look at this as the past, this is going to be the present, and then this column is going to be the future, right? So now that I've mentioned that, let's take a closer look at each of the columns to see what they might want to offer in terms of insight. And so now going to the first column, we have child, we have coffin, and we have stars. So now the first thing that I notice is that child can represent something that's beginning. And so again, that would fit with the context of the question, because Jane has just met Bill, you know, through online dating, and now she's asking about the potential for a future with Bill. You know, she's asking basically like, okay, we went out on a date, how do things look at this point? So there's that, but that's what I like with child. Now, the interesting thing to note about child is that child can also represent an actual child. And so now there may be a child in the mix, and that would make sense on two ways. Number one, if we go with the idea that snake can represent another woman, then we have a situation here, and we'll talk more about that when we look at the rows, but there could be a situation where there is another woman and she may have a child, right? And that could be the complication going forward with this relationship with Bill, right? And so going further, if we take a technique that's known as knighting, and so knighting would be where you have a card and you either count 1 and over 2, you count 1 and you go either down or up 2, or you go over 2 and you count down 1 or up 1, right? So in this particular case, if we knight child now knights, to man. So we have 1, 2, and then the knighting card. So there may be a connection with Bill and a child. And so he may have a child with another woman. And in this particular case, then the other woman may be an ex, right? So we have, we have actually 4 people involved in this situation potentially. We have Bill and Jane, the couple. We may have another woman, and then we may have a child involved in that too, right? So child could be 2 things. It could represent the beginning, but it could also represent, an actual child. So there's that, right? Then coffin here, and I love the fact that the coffin card is actually behind the lady card. I would be more concerned if she was facing the coffin, right? So it could be saying too, like there's something in Jane's past that has come to an end. So we could look at this 1 or 2 ways. It could be there's something that she has decided to come to an end. So it could be this whole idea of, maybe being on her own, not being in a relationship. That part is coming to an end, especially if she's now looking at Bill, focusing her attention on Bill and moving that situation forward. So there could be that, like there's some sort of confinement, some sort of limitation, some sort of restriction that Jane was involved in her past, but now that has come to an end, right? So there's that. Now, it could also be, too, there is an ending as a result of something beginning, right? So we have the child card. Child card can represent a beginning, but coffin can also represent something ending. So we have 2 things going on. We have something beginning, and as a result of that beginning, something else is coming to an end, right? So there's that. But I love the fact that the coffin card is behind the lady card, right? And so then we have stars, and I already talked about stars. So for me, stars can represent hopes and wishes, right? So maybe in her past, she kind of like limited and restricted her sense of being hopeful for the future, And then if we mirror child and stars, now that she's beginning to be hopeful about the future, right? So there's that possibility. But now keeping in context with the question, what I love about stars is, for me, stars can represent the internet and doing something online. And so that's just another validation or confirmation, if you will, about the scenario that I just happened to throw out there randomly. So that's another way that we get confirmation and validation, because another way of reading the cards could be, this is above the woman, so this might be something that's on her mind or something that she's consciously aware of. And then the row beneath the significator card is either something that she's not consciously aware of, or it could be something that she has worked on overcoming. Right? So if we go with that, then there's a sense of like working through whatever the limitations or restrictions that she may have imposed upon herself in terms of online dating, right? So that's how I would look at the first column. So now let's take a look at the next column. So now here we are, we're taking a look at the column that represents the present. So we have tree, we have lady, and then we have ring, right? So the way I would read it is that the tree card is above the lady. So this could represent what's on her mind. And if we go with that, then tree can represent something that is growing and something that is developing. It could represent something where patience is going to be required. So that's what I would look at. And so that would, again, match the nature or the context of the question, because Jane is asking about where does it look like things are going with Bill. So she's saying, how is this going to grow? How is this going to develop? So I like that with tree above her, right? And then again, this card for me could represent branching out. And so with the inset for me, which is the 7 of hearts. So hearts is the suit that represents love, it could represent relationships, things like that. But for me, the 7 of hearts connected tree can represent developing a connection. So I like seeing that above her. Now, ring is a very good card to have beneath her, because it talks about the process that she's engaged in, right? One of my meanings for ring is engagement. So this is something that she's already engaged in because it's below her, right? And she's asking, again, about the nature of the relationship. She's asking with this card, these two cards, she's asking, is this going to be a serious thing? You know? It could also be, too, if we go with the idea, she may be a little cautious if she's been, imposing some sort of limitation and restriction on herself in terms of relationships and dating and all of that. It could be, too, the possibility here, if we mirror these two cards, is that there may be some healing that needs to be done, or some healing process that she's going through in relation or in connection to a previous commitment, engagement, maybe even marriage. If we take coffin into account, it could be like maybe she was married in her past, that came to an end, and so maybe that's set the stage for some sort of limitation or restriction. She may have been closed off, she may have been shut down with coffin in the past, and so now she's kind of opening herself up to the possibilities. But she's also got her radar up because of possible complications, and so she wants to know what could potentially be showing up. And I guess maybe before she commits too much, so there's that. But Ring is a card that shows promise. If you go with the idea that a marriage ceremony is where two people make promises to one another, then this card here can suggest that this new relationship that she is cautiously committing herself to shows a great deal of promise. And that would make sense if we go with the previous column and stars being the card that is next to it. It shows a lot of promise. There's a lot of hope here, right? So I love that these two cards are above and below her. So that is how I would read this particular column. Again, tree would represent something about growth and development. It may be that she's going to be patient. She wants to take her time. She wants to see what the relationship is going to be rooted in or grounded in, going with the idea that tree has roots. But, she's also wanting to know, how serious could this be? But again, this card here at the bottom shows that this relationship could potentially be very promising, something that could grow and develop over time, right? So that's how I would read the present column. So now let's take a look at the next column. Okay, so now we're looking at the future column, and so again we have snake, the same card I referenced to as opening up the 3x3 or the box or the portrait here. So there's snake, and then there's the gentleman, of course, which is great to see, and then book at the bottom of the column. So again, referencing snake one more time, this could represent the possibility of a complication in the future if we go with the idea that this is the future now. So there's a complication in the future, some sort of entanglement. It could be as a result of another woman. The fact that it's above the man card could be like something that he has been thinking about, something of that nature, or that there's a close connection. It could also say too, like the man is the one who's bringing the complication to the relationship in some shape, form, or fashion, right? So there's that. Now, it could also be suggestive of the possibility that I tend to look at snake as a card that can represent deceit. If you go with the idea that a snake has a forked tongue, so for me, could be about, one's honesty, one's ability to be forthcoming. So there could be something about that as a way to describe the man. So we could go with, on the one hand, it could be representing a woman who may be perceived as, a threat or a rival. But it could also be, too, a way to describe Bill. So he could either be very complicated, he could be a very complex man, or he could be someone who may not be as honest as he would like for Jane to believe. So there's those possibilities. And I'm only saying that because book could reinforce this idea of not necessarily being totally forthcoming, because here we have the book, and book can represent knowledge. So it could represent in the future that Jane is going to learn something that she doesn't already know in the present moment, right? Because this is about knowledge being gained. This is about something being learned, right? And now going with the visual and that the book is closed, it could represent that the man, since it's connected to the man, it's coming after the gentleman card in the column, could represent he has a secret, or there's a mystery about him that she will uncover in time. So that's a couple of ways of looking at that. Either way, if we go with the idea like this could be the complication of another woman or a rival, then this could suggest that that's something she's going to learn about in the future. She doesn't know it yet, but it's going to show up. Or that there's going to be something she learns about Bill, and it may have to do with something that he may have withheld from her. And that could jeopardize or complicate their relationship if she doesn't see him as being very honest. So there's a couple of ways of looking at that particular column. So now the next thing we could do is we could take a look at the rows. So now if we look at the top row, we have snake, we have tree, and we have child. So again, keeping with my keyword associations, what I personally ascribe to the cards, and that's a way to kind of create consistency in your readings. Like if you have a particular keyword or keywords, stick with those, but also make sure that they also fit the context of the question. So here we have snake, that represents complication for me, tree, that can represent growth and development. So if we pair these two cards, we have a complication that grows or a complication that develops, right? And then if we throw child into the mix, it could be something involving a child. And again, that would make sense if we take the idea of knighting the man card and the child card. If we knight them, then it could be the complication that involves a child. A complication grows and develops that may pertain to a child. You know? But it could also be, too, that if we go with the idea about maybe why Jane is asking the question, then this row could suggest that there is a complication that maybe Jane saw growing or developing from the start, keeping with the idea that child can represent something that's beginning, something that's starting, you know, something like that. Now, it could also be, too, like, you know, the complication wasn't that big or wasn't that big of a deal because child can also represent something small, right? So it could suggest like the complication is a small one if we mirror these two cards, right? But even though it may be small, or it may have been small at the start, the tree card in the middle suggests like, okay, maybe it's kind of taking a life of its own. You're starting to grow and develop, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm seeing that with the top row. So now let's take a look and go one row down. And so going with the next row down, we have gentleman, we have lady, and we have coffin. Well, now here we go. We could look at this as, you know, a situation involving a man and a woman comes to an end. That could be one way of looking at it. You know, another way of looking at it, it could be like the man and the woman have some form of limitation or restriction, right? So if we look at it in the sense of a limitation or restriction, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's over, but it could just be like a bump in the road, right? Kind of thing, and they have to work out whatever the limitation or restriction is, right? So there's two ways of reading that. We could actually it could literally say the man and the woman come to an end, or the man and the woman reach an end, right? But I'm going to go with the idea like this is about limitation and restriction. So there's two ways of looking at that. And then if we go to the next row down, we have book, we have ring, and we have stars. So now, and that's why I'm going with the idea of coffin being about, you know, limitation or restriction, you know, something about like, you know, taking a break kind of thing, where, because this row seems pretty positive, right? So it could be knowledge, if we go with the book being about knowledge and education, so knowledge about a commitment. You know, it could also be too, you know, given Lenormand being really literal, I already talked about the idea about book being about, you know, reading cards and doing a reading, so it could be a reading about a commitment, you know, and if we go with that, then stars could represent something that is inspirational, something that the person can aspire to, something that offers clarity, something that offers direction, something that offers guidance. So it could be literally read as the reading about a commitment leads to guidance and offers direction, and also provides clarity. That could be a way of looking at that, you know. So, but it also could be too, like learning about a relationship or learning about a commitment leads to hope, leads to a wish being fulfilled, you know. So that's how I would look at that. So that is how I would read the rose. So now I'm going to, in the next segment, talk about another way of gaining meaning with this particular layout. All right, and so now I'm going to touch on the last technique I would like to offer in this particular video. And so this is called the diamond. So after I look at the focus card, after I look at the opening and closing cards, after I look at the columns, past, present, and future, depending on direction, and then I look at the rows, this is the last technique I use. And so it's called the diamond technique. And so what it is that you want to read cards 2, you want to read card 4, 8, and 6. And they form a diamond around the significator, right? So you want to read them as a combination to see what possible insight they may offer. They may offer a totally new insight that you haven't seen in any of the other combinations, or, and I like this part of it, they could already restate or reinforce something that you've already discovered through the other combinations. And I like when messages repeat themselves because it kind of confirms and validates the previous message, but it also restates that particular interpretation, right? So if we go with what I've already said about these cards, so if we take tree as the first card, for me, tree represents growth and development, keeping in line with the context of the question. The question was about, you know, where's the relationship going, you know, potentially. So we have growth and development with tree. Gentleman, of course, represents Bill the man. The ring represents the commitment. Is it becoming serious? What do we need to know about that? So does it hold promise? That kind of thing. And then coffin, we touched on coffin. In this particular context could represent either some form of limitation or restriction or something having to do with something coming to an end. So if I were to read them as a combination, I would possibly offer the growth and development of a commitment with the man either becomes limited or restricted or comes to an end, going with the two aspects of coffin, however you want to choose to look at that. So again, that could be, you know, the growth and development of a commitment with the man, or with Bill in this particular case, either becomes limited, restricted, or comes to an end, right? And then we could look to coffin and say, the natural question could be like, well, why? Why could it come to an end? Why could it become restricted or limited? Then we could look at the cards that are knighting coffin, and so we have 2. If we go over 2 and up 1, we're back to snake. So the limitation or restriction or the ending could come as a result of the complication that we've already talked about, the entanglement that we have already talked about, the possibility of another person being involved that we already talked about, the idea here about not maybe totally being honest. Those are all things that could contribute to the limitation, restriction, or the ending of this particular situation. The other card would be, if we go over 2 and down 1, then we have book, right? And so book can represent, again, knowledge that is uncovered, knowledge that is gained, you know, something that is learned about, you know, going with the whole aspect of book being about learning and knowledge, right? It could also be as a result of, if we go back to mirroring the cards, you know, the complication or the complexity or the entanglement that becomes uncovered or discovered. But again, it could also be, if it's not due to, you know, an actual third party, then it could just be as a result of Bill maybe not totally being forthcoming and being honest, you know, keeping a secret, right? So those would be the contributing factors to either the limitation, the restriction, or the actual ending of this situation. And so on that note, I will end this particular video. This will be the first in a series that I'm doing on 9-card Lenormand reading. So one method, like I've already talked about in this particular case, was selecting a significator. You're going through the deck and you pick out the face card that represents the person who's going to be the focus of the situation. In the next video, I will do a similar method, but we will pick a topic card that reflects the nature of the question or the situation. So As I close, I'm James Himm Mitchell, and I want to first thank you for sharing the space here with me for this particular video, and I look forward to sharing the same space with you in the next video in this series. So until then, I'm hoping that you have a wonderful day, and take care.